Welcome, everyone, to the latest in a series of MSU Center for Interdisciplinarity, or C4I, visiting faculty colloquia. We appreciate very much that you've taken time out of your day to spend it with us and to participate in this session and listen to Dr. Fagan's talk. Since we are based at Michigan State, we begin these events with the Msu Land Acknowledgement. Michigan State University occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, Three Fires Confederacy of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi peoples. In particular, the university resides on land ceded in the 1819 Treaty of Saginaw. We recognize Michigan's 12 federally recognized Native nations, historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences. I'm going to be putting a few links in the chat that provide more information about the MSU land acknowledgement and also a map of Indigenous lands that I think is quite informative. There you go. For those of you who are first timers at C4I event, the Michigan State University Center for Interdisciplinarity is a research and outreach center based in the College of Arts and Letters at MSU. We conduct research on cross-disciplinary process and use what we learn to inform our facilitation efforts, and data from these efforts are then inputs into our ongoing research efforts. One mode of cross-disciplinary facilitation involves hosting events and lectures that inform the practice of interdisciplinarity. Another involves hosting experts as visiting fellows who can enhance our understanding of how cross-disciplinary research and practice function. I can't really imagine a better combination of those than what we have today with Dr. Fagan. We're very pleased to be hosting this event, and it's at the intersection of these two modes. This is a lecture by C4I visiting fellow, Dr. Melinda Fagan. In different times, we'd all be together in a room hosting her on campus, but we are happy to be hosting her virtually today. With that, I will go ahead and introduce our speaker. Again, we're very thrilled to have Dr. Fagan with us. Dr. Melinda Bonnie Fagan is Sterling M. McMurrin Professor of Philosophy at the University of Utah. Her research focuses on experimental practice in biology, particularly stem cell and developmental biology, explanation, and philosophical conceptions of objectivity and evidence. She is the author of Philosophy of Stem Cell Biology, published in 2013 by Palgrave Macmillan, and Elements in the Philosophy of Biology Stem Cells, published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press, as well as 50 journal articles, book chapters, and commentaries on topics in philosophy of science and biology. Her educational background is quite interdisciplinary. She holds a BA and a PhD in biology, a PhD coming in 1998 from Stanford, a master's degree in philosophy from the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD in the history and philosophy of science from Indiana University. Before joining the University of Utah faculty in 2014, Dr. Fagan was assistant professor of philosophy at Rice University, where she developed her research program and taught courses in philosophy of science, theory of knowledge, and social epistemology. She is currently working on a monograph about explanation in interdisciplinary contexts centered on social concepts of collaboration and mutuality. Dr. Fagan is with us today to deliver the presentation, Low Effort Interdisciplinarity, a Proposal. Dr. Fagan.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm going to go to the share screen and
okay.
Let's see if this.
That looks good so far.
Is that looking? Yeah, I'll go into the slideshow now. All right. Thanks so much. And this talk is on the monograph that's currently in progress. I just started my timer, so I'm hoping not to go too far over time. So the title here might suggest a kind of tragic misunderstanding, since interdisciplinary research is famously challenging time and labor intensive. And the idea of low effort interdisciplinarity might sound like an oxymoron. I hope that's not the case. I will be arguing that there's one kind of interdisciplinary work, one class of cases that needs to satisfy only very minimal conditions to succeed. And in principle, it's very easy to meet those conditions, hence the low effort moniker. But there are features of scientific practice that shape scientists' attitudes so that it's often the case that even those low standards aren't met. And recognizing those attitudinal obstacles is a first step toward overcoming them. And that little sketch I just gave is the structure of my argument today. That's the plan of the talk. I'm going to start by specifying the class of cases that I'm interested in, the kind of ID work I'm talking about. And that'll take a little bit of time because my views on interdisciplinarity are part of the larger account of scientific explanation. So I'm looking at interdisciplinarity through that lens. Once that background is established, I'm going to work through those minimal conditions, what makes it low effort. These are very briefly coherence requirements that apply to relations between different explanatory models. And finally, I'll offer some guidelines to help meet those low requirements. Very briefly, the idea is that if scientists are in the right headspace, if they have the right attitudes toward a project, this kind of interdisciplinary work is very straightforward. It can be very low effort. Scientists just have to be thinking about the work in a way that sets them up to be collaborators in this particular kind of framework. The big caveat with this project is, of course, this is a book project in progress, especially the guidelines section is very much work in progress. And so feedback and criticism are really welcome. And so I'm going to make sure that I stop talking in time for us to have a good long Q&A session. So background, this is the philosophical approach I'm using that'll help set up and pick out the kind of interdisciplinary work that I'm interested in. So the basic idea of this view, I call it explanatory particularism. It's to think about explanation as a collaborative activity and then unpack and explore the implications of that move. So the core thesis of the view is here. It's that a scientific explanation is a product of a particular scientific community that's significant, specialized, and advances understanding for that community. So I'm going to unpack these terms. If this seems like an incredibly obvious statement, that's the same page that I'm on, but it turns out that philosophers of science who study explanation do not think of it this way. And so each and every part of this account needs to be kind of specified and clarified. So first of all, what counts as a particular scientific community? Social organization of science is really complex. It involves groups at a great number of grains. There's research teams, laboratories, large collaborations, multi-site assemblages, subfields, traditional disciplines, and many, many intermediate kinds of cases. And at the coarsest grain, one can conceive the totality of scientific inquiry at any one time as the scientific community. And that's often the way that philosophers of science speak of it. And of course, all these groups are comprised of individual scientists, although the line between who is and who is not a scientist is not fully determinate. I will put that aside for now. Come back to that later. The scientific communities that are relevant to this project are of the kind of intermediate grain. They're broader than individual research teams and teams of co-authors, but more fine-grained than the traditional disciplines of biology, chemistry, physics, etc. I have in mind subfields and specializations like tumor immunology or structural biology or integrative systems biology. It's a long and continually expanding list. I'm not aware of any rigorous individuation criteria for scientific communities at that grain, but in practice, we can identify them pretty well. There's a lot of social infrastructure at this grain. There's a lot of activities of societies and journals and regular meetings. And I think it's fairly straightforward for philosophers of science studying science in practice to be able to pick them out because of the social infrastructure around them. Now, scientific communities are epistemic communities. They produce knowledge, among other things. And so any scientific field that persists for a while is going to yield some epistemic products. And some of those stand out as significant. These are major achievements that are recognized, highlighted by the community, and often communicated to a wider audience. So what I'm calling an explanation or an EP explanation, sometimes to clarify, They are a subset of those achievements. There's no philosophical analysis here supposed of achievement or significance. This is something scientists are going to tell us, the achievements that matter for their field. And not all of these, of course, are explanations. The ones that are advance understanding. And there are several philosophical accounts of understanding that I engage with in this project, but at a much later stage. For explanatory particularism as a general approach, I want to leave the nature of understanding very, very open. So I agree with philosophers of science who closely link explanation and understanding, but I think we should be particularists about both of them, meaning what understanding and an advance thereof amounts to varies widely across scientific communities. So rather than prejudge the matter with a philosophical theory, philosophers should look to the scientists to identify and communicate the achievements that advance understanding in their field. So you can operationalize it very easily, is ask a representative sample of scientists in their community, does it advance our understanding about some achievement they're excited about? If they mostly say yes, that's enough, it's an explanation. And that question immediately raises follow-ups of understanding of what and in what ways. So if you want to know more, you want to know what the target of the explanation is and the features the explanation has. And so on my account, this is how philosophers of science should study explanation, examine these important achievements in practice in their local contexts of construction and use. And explanations so defined are very diverse in ways that traditional philosophical accounts of explanation tend to obscure. And so that brings us to the last term of the setup here. Unlike the others, specialization isn't really a feature that's communicated directly to philosophers by scientists. It's grounded in scientific practice, but it's not really aspects that scientists themselves would be telling us. It's often things that are in the background for practicing scientists. An explanation produced by a particular scientific community is specialized in the sense that it's constructed in the context of a distinct set of methods, goals, and norms, values associated with explanation. And it's all directed toward understanding some object of inquiry. An explanation shows up as an achievement by successfully accommodating and harmonizing the different values and constraints of its particular context. So that's the starting point that I have here. It's a view of explanation, summed up here as what I think are a pretty uncontroversial set of claims about scientific practice. They are not uncontroversial, however, in philosophy of science, so I've needed to spell them out fairly at some length. So explanation is an important scientific goal. Scientific explanations are diverse. They reflect values and other features of the communities in which they're structured and used, they're specialized, and explanation advances understanding. That's a straightforward philosophical thesis. And to be clear, the moniker here is new, explanatory particularism, but obviously a lot of scholars in philosophy of science, history and philosophy of science are already using this approach. So I didn't invent any of this out of whole cloth. What I am contributing is the label and arguing that this is how philosophers should study scientific explanation. So what does explanatory particularism then have to do with interdisciplinarity? Moving to that topic now, on this view, scientific communities are continually meeting with one another and splitting to generate distinct specializations. So interdisciplinarity very broadly refers to meetings between different specialized scientific communities. Not all of these concern explanation. And so there's a great deal of interdisciplinary work that falls outside the scope of what I'll be discussing today. I'm not trying to define or analyze interdisciplinarity in general or to restrict what falls into that category. What I am going to do is to focus on this class of cases, projects that aim or require what I'll call an interdisciplinary explanation, or an IDE for short. It's easier to say. An IDE is an achievement of understanding, an AP explanation that's constructed by multiple specialized scientific communities instead of only one. And the more disparate those communities are, the greater the differences in their particular specialized value-laden ideas about what an explanation is, the more difficult it is to combine them to construct an IDE. So that's the problem. And my response to that is this account of low effort interdisciplinarity. Low effort isn't no effort, so constructing an IDE still takes work, but the barriers to it aren't so high as it might first appear. That's what I'm going to argue. And this argument uses two additional philosophical resources. So I'm almost done with the setup, but not quite. First is that I define EP explanations as a kind of scientific model in 1, 2 grafted philosophical senses of model. So very, very roughly, by a model, I mean a relaxed version of Geary's classic account of models in scientific practice, combined with some aspects of Morgan and Morrison's models as mediators view. And the basic idea is this schema of models having to do with a 4-place relation between an agent, model, target, and purposes. So on this view, an explanatory model is constructed in the scientific community, the agents, with the purpose of advancing understanding of some target. The nature of the target, the nature of the model is left completely open. So it's very inclusive. Anything that plays this role is a model and an EP explanation. The second philosophical resource is that I define explanatory model construction as a collaborative social activity. So more on that in a bit. But thinking about explanations as models lets me zero in pretty precisely on the cases of interest in interdisciplinary connections. And those are just those meetings where 2 or more explanatory models constructed in different scientific communities have to be combined in some way. The explanation might be the project's end goal, but often understanding is a prerequisite for more practical goals. There needs to be some kind of combined, conjoined, and hybridized understanding of the situation that involves explanatory resources from more than one specialized community. The details in a lot of the situation will depend on the particular communities involved. This is a particularist approach. And so there will be a lot to say about any particular case and the advantages and disadvantages of explanations and combining them. However, in this framework, there are a few general points to be made about this class of cases, and it's those general points that I'm going to focus on here. So we can classify relations between models in terms of 2 axes. This is the horizontal one, is the process of model construction, and the vertical one is the degree of connection, the extent to which the models are connected. So just focusing on the process, every explanatory model starts from early sketchy proposals in a community to a recognized achievement that fits the definition I started at the beginning, that advances understanding in that community. And any connection between models has to happen somewhere along that path. So that's the horizontal axis. The vertical axis reflects how extensive the connection is. Does it involve the entirety of each model, which is the way philosophers of science traditionally think of it? Is it a one-to-one mapping of elements among them, between them, or a subset of those elements? Is it a purely formal conjunction? And so on. And so in this graphical framework, we can distinguish 2 main clusters of interdisciplinary research. And these are what I've called early stage high degree and late stage low degree. The second is what I'm going to call low effort interdisciplinarity. And if all the relevant models are at an early stage, starting with the high proportion, then all of them are at that sketchy early work in progress stage. There's a lot more work to do. And this situation happens in interdisciplinary projects where the goal is to innovate a new conceptual framework. There isn't a lot to work with in the way of a finished explanation, but there needs to be an answer to some new problem of interest, a new solution to a problem of interest. And so the task here is to construct an explanation almost from scratch. You'd expect then a very high degree of connection between the explanatory resources from different communities. There's a lot of shared elements, a lot of ties between different elements, and a lot of joint construction and complementary explanatory work. And so this is a lot like regular EP explanation within a community, but much more difficult, because instead of a shared background and values associated with explanation and consensus, you've got at least 2 different viewpoints in play. And constructing an IDE under those conditions takes a great deal of time and effort, and often frequent regular interactions among participants from different communities. What's happening in this kind of research is effectively a new community with a new style of explanation. And I think this kind of interdisciplinary research maps more or less onto what's often called transdisciplinary research. Very labor intensive, very interactive, highly oriented toward innovation, and it often fails. The situation is very different for this other cluster, and that'll be my focus for the rest of the talk, the late stages of construction. And in these cases, each of the communities has constructed an explanatory model of some target that's a pretty well-established achievement. It's nearly there or very close to it. And then something spurs members of those communities to combine their explanatory forces, a real world problem, a funding call, interpersonal motivations, combinations of those, whatever. But work at a late stage in the model construction process, an IDE of this kind is, I think, more likely to succeed with a low degree of connection. And the reason for this is that members of a scientific community are pretty understandably reluctant to give up on features of a hard-won explanatory advance. And it's hard to see how one could negotiate new explanatory standards or values. In each community, the explanation is largely fait accompli. And by definition, it's a significant achievement. So reconceptualizing all or most of it, or somehow cutting out bits and pieces or taking on only bits, that's going to be very unwelcome. And so the best strategy for this kind of interdisciplinary work is to leave each specialized explanatory model mostly unaltered. And that's part of the low effort aspect, that all that's needed for this kind of interdisciplinary work when the models are at a pretty late stage of construction is a narrow bridge to form between them. And the conditions for such a bridge, that'll be my focus next, are also very weak. So a tiny connection between models and very weak conditions for such a connection to satisfy. So that'll be the focus for the next part of the talk, what I call the bridging relations between models. And so the conditions I'm going to discuss here are implications of social action theory. So here's the social action philosophical resource coming back. And the key idea here, I'm going to skip over the theoretical background here. And if folks are interested, we can go into more detail later. But the key idea is just that the essence of collaborative activity is an intentional difference between a difference in the attitude that's had by participants in the activity that's distinct from the attitude they would have doing a correspondingly similar activity by themselves. The classic example in this area of philosophy is walking together. You can have two people walking together as a group, interacting with one another and with attitudes that are connected in ways that you don't see with two people walking in the same direction along the same path. So collective intention is an integrated complex of attitudes of participants A and B in some social activity. So here I'm building on Michael Bratman's work, and I posit a three-layer intercalated structure of collective intention that interweaves participant attitudes towards some shared activity, conceptualized as the goal, and attitudes towards one another. And this structure implies constraints on participants' attitudes that translate into a set of pro-social norms for collaborating in this way. Humility, a particular kind of stance of equality, and respect. So here, in this case, the task is constructing a bridge between different explanatory models. Apply that social action framework to this kind of case, where the task is to construct this bridge. The roles of agent A and B are taken by individuals working in different specializations. So they're committed to different methods, values, and norms for constructing explanatory models. And because of those differences, the features that would tend to stabilize collective intention in other kinds of collaborative activity are mostly absent. So the stability has to be in the connecting bridge itself. And so that's the requirement, the stability for this kind of collaborative activity that imposes general constraints on the bridge. And in this account, I've glossed those requirements in terms of coherence. Just very briefly, there needs to be an extension from either side, and that's being some adjustment to each field's explanatory model that makes contact with the other field. So there's coherence constraints on near and far sides, reciprocal adjustments to each model. And the third requirement is just that those reciprocal adjustments, bridges emanating from one side to the other, don't undermine one another. And that's it. Now, it's hard to get a handle on without an example, so I'm going to work through those requirements with an example to illustrate. And the communities I have in mind here are epidemiology on the one hand and immunology on the other, with explanatory models of how a vaccine works. Just one example. So I won't go into the details of the scientific cases for reasons that will shortly be obvious, but really briefly, epidemiological models represent a vaccine's working in a specified human population as an intervention on the frequency and distribution of disease. So you have a population of individuals impacted by one or more infectious agents transmitted among those individuals with their effects on population demographic variables. So a vaccine works by reducing those effects and ideally eliminating the pathogen from the population. And the resultant understanding is all in terms of these demographic variables and features of the population as appropriate for applications to public health. With immunology, the models are very, very different, and they represent vaccines as specific interventions on the immune system of a generic physiological individual, in practice almost always a human or a mouse. So the immune system consists of multiple effector pathways that operate at various timescales via the interactions of very diverse cell populations and bioactive molecules distributed in bodily tissues and organs. So it's very decentralized. It has multiple layers of feedback and regulation and specific and non-specific pathways that merge and synergize with one another in ways that are not fully understood. A vaccine works by shifting the time frame of a mammal's immune response to a specific pathogen. It's a very minor adjustment to the immune system, and actually just a shift in the time frame in one part of the response, just so the organism doesn't experience disease symptoms associated with the pathogen. So again, more to say about each of these kinds of model, obviously, but the key point for my purposes now is these are just really different models that are clearly relevant to each other. Now, the two fields, although the models are very different, they're not that disparate in their social institutional context. And so there are pretty obvious connections between them. It's a lot more challenging to do this with computer science and anthropology or other areas of biology and some systems theory, for example. But the principle is going to be the same. And it's nice to have a fairly obvious example to work with. So I'm going to use these examples to illustrate how bridging connections work between models, how to connect these two really different kinds of models of how a vaccine works. So the first requirement is that the bridge has to be securely anchored in each specialization. That's the near side, meaning there's some adjustment made to each of the explanatory models that enables connection with another. And that adjustment, that new element, should cohere with that field's explanatory style. And what that rules out are elements that present some kind of immediate explanatory challenge, some mystery, non sequitur, or direct explanandum, something that just cries out for explanation. Now, in this case, the clearest point of contact between the two models is the idea of an individual human agent. In epidemiological models, these are nodes in a network of health relevant interactions in a specified population. And in immunological models, an individual agent contains and is affected by operations of that agent's immune system. So there's a near side adjustment needed for each of them, fairly straightforward. From the epidemiological side, it's just the idea that human agents have some kind of inner biological life. There are dynamic interactions going on with a pathogen in their body. The details are a black box. The adjustment is just to allow for it being there. Not really a part of the epidemiological model itself, but an adjustment to it that enables a connection with the other side. And the corresponding adjustment for immunology is just that the individual organism with its physiological immune system also has an external social environment. Both of these cases, it's an acknowledgement of the limits of a model and a gesture to what might be outside them. So that's the near side connection. It can't be something that's a non sequitur. It can't be something that just immediately has to be then explained. It has to be something that gestures toward what is a limit of the model, what's just outside it. Now, that's the near side. The far side, there's also a coherence requirement. There should be contact with the other specialization. But here the requirement is even more relaxed because the members of one specialization are pretty nearly entirely ignorant of what is going on in the other fields. So all that's ruled out here are any obvious common sense incompatibilities between the bridging idea and the other's model. And so I think what's going on in the vaccine case is just the notion that something causally relevant is happening in the other black box domain. So a vaccine is doing something inside the human agents that receive it. There's some causal thing going on. The social environment on the immunological side includes interactions with other physiological agents. So there's a kind of causal notion going on in whatever that near adjustment is. And I think it's very important that this is a non-expert kind of view. The causal notions in play within immunology and epidemiology, the way that causality works in those models is actually really different. They don't use very similar notions of causality in an explanatory way. But for this far side connection, I think it has to be a kind of unnuanced common sense picture of causality. Just something is happening in there for the epidemiologist, something is happening out there for the immunologist. That's it. So really, really minimal requirement on the far side there. So what you've got at this point is each explanatory model extended by some adjusted idea of one element, here the individual human agent. And that adjustment coheres with the near side specialization in a nuanced way. It's something just outside the limits of the model. And it coheres with the far side in a very non-expert, naive, common sense way. And those reciprocal extensions will, for obvious reasons, rarely, if ever, coincide. So there's a final coherence requirement that's just what I summarized as middle coherence in the other diagram. It's just that the bridge from one side not undermine the connection in the other direction, meaning you've got traffic in both directions. And for two models, the two vaccine models, it's by way of these simple causal connections. I mentioned that why do the causal connections need to be naive? Well, some of it is because there's a non-expert component to it, but it's also important for the this middle coherence. You have to think of causality in a way that doesn't actually cause any kind of conflict with what's happening on the other side. So a vaccine's within agent action has effects on the population phenomena that are the epidemiological models focus. And then for immunological models, you've got interactions with others that affect a human organism's internal immune responses. So you've got causal processes emanating from the other side that give inputs to each model in ways that fit with each. The two models don't collapse into one another, but this way of conceptualizing the link between them securely connects them. Sophisticated understanding of what's left out, a very naive understanding of what might be coming in from the other side, and that's it. So putting all this together gives conditions for connecting distinct explanatory models for what I call an IDE. And I won't work through this analysis. This is this texty slide is really just a collation of all the coherence requirements I just talked through. So the key point is that these are really minimal requirements. There's no element of either model that has to conform to the standards of the other field. Not even the bridge does that. So the bridge is actually a construction in either direction with this minimal coherence in the middle. And so that's why this work is low effort. All that it really takes is finding and articulating bridging connections on both sides. A shared element isn't even required as long as you can articulate what the difference is between things. And so also importantly, no expertise on the other field or its explanatory nuances is needed. All that's required is a way to conceptually traverse from one model to the other, hence low effort interdisciplinarity. Now, it might seem like if that's right, that's low effort, low reward. Why would you bother with a connection like this? So I'm going to give a few reasons for why that might be interesting. One obvious one is that a single narrow bridge can scaffold further connections between fields. Once this kind of tie is established, this can lead to further and richer interdisciplinary contacts. The image I always use here is of interlace. That's proliferating ties that weave into a tessellation. So in the long term, less metaphorically, an IDE of this low effort kind can lead to richer ties that could lead to conceptual innovations of the kind that's sought in interdisciplinary work. There's also an advantage for philosophers thinking about explanations in fields that are very closely related. There's often a tendency to conflate or lump together quite different models in areas of life science and medicine, where you've got models that are connected yet distinct. They're not assimilated or confounded with each other. So I think that this kind of approach can be a good disambiguation tool for thinking about how explanations use maybe shared notions like gene, genomic, causality, fields that are slightly different with great explanatory effect in how they deal with these things. So an aid for disambiguation. There's also an ideal of unity of science here if you pull back and think of science as a patchwork of lightly connected explanatory achievements. And the significance of that is it's an image of the unity of science that rejects any fixed hierarchy of the sciences. You've got a unity without loss of diversity, a way of thinking about sciences as interconnected, but without eliding or subsuming or reducing the differences between the particular kinds of explanations. So if this kind of unity is valuable, then the EP account, the IDE account, has a little normative bite in the sense that scientific communities that fail to make any connections with other scientific fields, that eschew any kind of explanatory links with other models, are actually failing in an important scientific goal. I said, if this kind of unity by connection is valuable, and I think it is, and this is point number 4 here, this is a way of thinking about science that makes its epistemic authority pro-social, by which I mean that the connections are achieved by collaborative interaction, meaning by taking on attitudes that facilitate collaboration, epistemic humility, a view toward pluralism, and respect for those working outside community boundaries. So explanatory values on this view are pro-social values. And this has some important implications for thinking about science-society relations. Most obviously, on the particularist approach, science is the furthest thing from a monolith. So there's no sharp dividing line between scientific and other groups. There's no demarcation between science and society. And then looking at the IDEA account itself, it extends really naturally to projects that involve communities that are outside of the sciences, as long as there's a shared aim of understanding and some target and something that's an achievement that can be thought of as an explanatory model. There's no actual restriction to some domain of the social world more than others, as long as there is an aim of understanding. So there are, instead of the question of linking these monolithic science and society sectors, there are many, many myriad different opportunities for building bridging connections with other social groups. And finally, this point number 5, fifthly, I guess, there are implications for understanding. And this is one of the parts that I'm working on right now. So for individual sciences, this is one of the questions, how can you be getting a lot out of a connection between fields when there's not any gained expertise in the other field? There isn't in this case. The gain of understanding here is relational, meaning that from an IDE that's constructed in this way, via bridging relations, an individual researcher understands how their model relates to those of other fields. They don't thereby become an expert in that field. They don't understand the other's explanation in the way that they would, but they can see how to get there from here. They get an expanded sense of the epistemic landscape of the sciences. There's a little counterfactual explication of that idea on the slide. And what I want to stress is that knowing that counterfactual gives researchers a form of understanding of how their own explanatory achievements relate to those of other specializations. And that seeing how one's model relates to others is in itself an epistemic advance. It's a way of pursuing this kind of social and relational understanding, puts scientific fields themselves into a picture of a wider community. And that sense of understanding one's own explanatory achievements in relation to others builds a kind of society of the sciences in a way that counteracts hyperspecialization that's been a trend in the sciences for decades. And that hyperspecialization has some very undesirable qualities. One being that the fragmentation of sciences in that hyper-specialized way, isolating them from one another, makes sciences vulnerable to other interests, economic, political, other social forces. So building more of a society of the sciences via relational understanding, and of course, beyond the sciences into other areas, that's a worthwhile project in its own right, in our current context, especially with so much hyper-specialization among scientific fields. So I think there are a number of reasons to pursue this kind of low effort interdisciplinarity. And in the last part of the talk, let me see, yes, good, there's enough time for this. I want to explore how philosophers can facilitate this kind of work. And here I'm taking a leaf from the Toolbox project and envisaging a philosopher playing the role of an interdisciplinary counselor. And this is modeled primarily on a number of planning sessions I've participated in over my career and many, many failed attempts at having these discussions. So I'm envisaging this counseling role as having a background in philosophy of science, because there are theories from philosophy of science that can serve as a resource in brainstorming bridging relations. But the philosophy of science part is not strictly necessary. What I think is that the person playing this role be someone who is outside of the fields being connected, someone who doesn't have an immediate stake in any of those explanatory models. And so the idea is to have participants in an interdisciplinary project, an IDE involving project, an interdisciplinary project that aims at or requires a conjoined explanation. The idea is to get participants into a mindset for constructing the bridge that satisfies these coherence requirements. Or if they can't do that, to figure that out very quickly and then restructure the project so you don't need to have an IDE. You can avoid it. If it isn't going to work, you might as well not spend the effort, even if it's relatively low effort. So the counselor is there to help begin the process of bridge construction, which participants then complete on their own, or they reimagine the project so they don't need to have an explanation in here. And so since I've emphasized what low effort project this is and why do you need a facilitator, why set this up, is I think that this counseling could be really helpful because explanations are so often implicated in boundary work across the sciences, that being talk by group members that draws a line between insiders and outsiders, us versus them. This is a feature of human behavior in general, but this kind of talk is deployed a lot around explanation because the stakes are high. Explanations are important for sciences. Scientific communities often arrange themselves around the style of explanation that they endorse. And there's a lot of us versus them explanatory talk. So for example, there's the little quote, the remark that all science is either physics or stamp collecting. That's a quote that's attributed to Ernest Rutherford. And it appears actually in a report on the Rutherford Jubilee International Conference in 1961. It wasn't just like a fun little remark that Rutherford made to someone. It was actually part of the report of this 1961 conference that commemorated, Rutherford wasn't there, it was about him, commemorated Rutherford's conception of the nuclear atom and Bohr's quantum theory of radiation. This was one of the events that were defining the physics community in the post-World War II era. So all physics and stamp collecting. This kind of boundary work ties into explanation quite frequently. And it's seen more generically in the distinction between explanation and mere description, which scientists and philosophers often refer to. But there isn't a single clear distinction between these two fixed things, explanation and mere description. That's a line that's being drawn to contrast the speaker's project, explanation, with others who are doing something else, something less. And that's not just team building rhetoric, it is that, this kind of talk about explanation, but researchers who are committed to their own specialization's view of explanation, which should be everyone who works in a specialization, they often find the explanations in other fields wanting or not even recognizable as explanations at all because they don't look like explanations, they look like something else. And so there's a tendency built into scientific practice to not respect the explanations of other specializations, to even look at them as explanatory. And philosophy of science has tended to exacerbate this, valorizing particular styles of explanation over others. It traditionally was explanations in theoretical physics. Now it's causal models of complex systems. But a scientific community's commitment to its view of explanation can itself be a barrier to interdisciplinary research. So that's why it's important to have maybe ways of lowering those barriers. So I am going to really go quickly now, but here's my thought about how to proceed operationally or more operationally with this. So the idea is to first meet with members of each community one-on-one to discuss their own field's explanation and really work out those basics of EP that I started with. What does it advance understanding? What qualities of the model afford that advance? What are the benefits of this? How does it bear on the project objectives? So that's just carrying out a particular study of explanation. And I said one-on-one because I think there's likely to be a fair amount of variability in the answers you would see between scientists, even within an explanation. But you would hope not a huge amount of variability. If you had very wide range of answers, that might be a problem for doing this kind of work at all. So after participants have characterized their models, you ask them about their limits. What about the target is left out or put aside? And if scientists don't acknowledge any limits, they probably shouldn't be involved in building the bridge. They should go do something else in the interdisciplinary project, but not that. And then wait a while, because if you immediately start thinking about the other fields model, it'll just be infelicitously compared to the other fields. They've been thinking about their own. So I would say then let them sit for a day or so, thinking about the limits of their model, and then meet with this. And this is the very last slide. This is the last thing I wanted to get to. And so I'll stop very, very quickly. But the idea here is to proceed with asking facilitating questions with members of an IDE project. And here I'm thinking of either all the members of one community, not a mixed group of communities for this stage, but either one-on-one or members of one community altogether and then another community altogether before they meet to discuss things. And you start with finding a shared element. Is it a yes or a no? If yes, try and think about how that element is used in their field, the other field. So get them thinking about their counterparts doing something that's similar, even though there are differences. So putting them on the same page with respect to the project, and then trying to articulate exactly what the difference is. I'm following this sort of left-hand side of things, but specifying what the common or contrastive element looks like on the other side. It's the idea, again, is to have people thinking about the far side of the bridge. What do things look like over there? Where are the connections? They won't be describing the far side accurately. That's okay. The important thing is to think about what they're doing as part of the same project. Now, if there's no obvious point of overlap and there's no kind of straightforward way to drill down into the differences and similarities, this is what I've called philosophical heuristics. There's actually work by Darden and Moll and Bechtel that have lists of possible relations for this. And so you try out ideas. So instead of using philosophical theories as dictating what's happening in the sciences, these are suggestions to see if anything sticks with members of a community. And here I'm thinking again about causal relations, part-whole relations, structure and function relations. There's a long list in philosophy of science and probably other fields as well. And then if that's still a no, then you pull back to the big picture and try to figure out if an IDE, if an explanation is really necessary for the project. And if it is, there has to be some explanatory contribution from the other field. And if people can't articulate what that contribution might be, that's when you give up. You just stop. It's not going to work to build a bridge between them. That doesn't mean the project stops, but it does mean that anybody who follows that pattern should not be working on building the bridge. And you want there to be some members within both communities who do not fall into that far right option, that there's some way of starting to articulate what the other side is doing. And then you can drill down deeper and get into what the other views on the other side might be. If only one community has members who are interested in making the bridge building connection work, it will not give up the project, stop. And instead reframe the interdisciplinary interaction in a way that you don't need to build an explanation. You won't be able to meet even those low standards. But what you hope is that you'll have participants who respond and are interested in articulating these things. And those are the ones who should sit down regularly and find other points of contact and build more and varied ties. So I have everything terminating in this lower left-hand box, but really that's the starting point for building richer ties as well. Okay, I realize I've probably gone longer than I had hoped, but that's where I will stop. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Melinda. Typically, we take a break, so give everybody a chance to kind of step away, maybe stretch a little bit, and then come back. Since we're together only to the bottom of the hour, so another 38 minutes or so. Why don't we take a 3-minute break till 4:55, and then come back and spend 35 minutes together in discussion. All right, Melinda is back, and so we're going to go ahead then and turn to questions. So if you want to just so follow Kevin's lead here, and just if you would raise your hand, use the raise hand function in Zoom. That'll create a queue, and then we'll just go in that order, if that's all right. Dr. Elliott.
Yeah, thank you so much. I found this fascinating, really interesting. So I wanted to just start with kind of a simple question, just to kind of clarify the landscape. Often, although I don't do a lot of work on interdisciplinarity, I enjoy, hearing folks like Michael talk about it. And I often hear people talking about, kind of unidisciplinary work, and then the potential for multidisciplinarity, perhaps, and then maybe interdisciplinarity, maybe transdisciplinarity. And I was just curious to get a sense from you. I could picture somebody saying, well, could this be a little bit like multidisciplinary work, where you're bringing these disciplines together, but you're not doing like a deep integration, you're just creating connections? So I was just wondering how you conceived of this, if this could be a way of characterizing good multidisciplinarity, or if you don't think that's fair, and just wanted to hear a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is a bit in the book, I say more about this, and I ended up not putting a lot of this part in the talk, but I'm really glad you raised this issue. So the way that I've been thinking about this, and comments welcome, is that multidisciplinarity would be on the extreme end, and meaning that it's discipline, multiple disciplines are working together, but there's not really a lot of change going on for any of them. So it's almost like off the shelf. And I know there's a lot of terminological problems in these areas. So that's what I mean when I'm thinking of it. Like, that's sort of how I'm envisaging multidisciplinarity. And sort of my way of thinking about the relations between models, if explanation is even on the table, but supposing that it is, then with multidisciplinarity, it would be something like a straightforward conjunctive relationship, something a lot like the way Chakravarti talks about different perspectives being related by, oh, from this point of view, it looks like this, and from this point of view, it looks like that. And it's much more like what I said very briefly, like a minimal kind of tie in terms of degree of connection would be something maybe purely formal. I was thinking of multidisciplinary as more like that. And then interdisciplinary is this gray, hugely varied area between really intense transdisciplinary communities that would be more like early stage, high degree of connection. And I was thinking of it as almost like intrinsically fuzzy, because even when I've seen those distinctions used, there's still a lot of variation within the range of things that are labeled interdisciplinarity, even if you're using it in that relatively narrow way where it's offset against the other prefixes. And so I guess the way I'm thinking of this account is that it's highlighting something that would be probably intermediate between multi and standardly interdisciplinarity. It is a lot weaker. So I think yes, but I was almost seeing it as this is a category that might actually get lost if you think about multi and interdisciplinarity as sharply distinct from one another. It's sort of blending aspects of both, because it is pretty deliberately not much of a connection, but I think it is more than just the formal one. So that's how I've been thinking of it, is multi is something where there really isn't much adjustment to make. It's sort of off the shelf and you can just conjunctivize it. Here, you really need to get creative with not everything, but just one element being the narrow connection. So really, yeah, I'm thinking of it as almost, something like both of those things, but I would still want to call it interdisciplinary rather than multi in that sense. Does that help?
Very helpful. And I love your point about kind of the formal conjunction kind of characterization of the multidisciplinary.
Oh, cool. Because I wanted to put that in, but I couldn't figure out how to include it.
That helps me to think of how you're thinking about this. And then I think that this is really kind of neat to think about it as a way, even if you're not getting these sort of like deep changes or connections. I just love the analogy to building bridges and just starting to recognize the potential for connection.
I'm glad you like that analogy, because I can't find a way to get away from it.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much.
All right. As you have questions, please be sure to raise your hand if you want to ask them. We'll take people in the order they ask the questions. And while we're waiting, I'm going to go ahead and ask a question. So I'm very curious about all aspects of this. I guess one question would be about how you see interdisciplinary explanations representing the range of actions or activities that interdisciplinary researchers engage in. So for instance, people talk about interdisciplinary research. And so there's lots and lots of things that people do that require knowledge sharing, blending methodologies, dealing with differences in scale of data collected, et cetera. I mean, lots and lots of different ways in which people come together over the course of an interdisciplinary project. And I'm curious to what extent the emphasis on explanation, right, the focus on explanation, which is consistent with your research program, and is obviously a very important part of like scientific interdisciplinarity for sure. But I'm curious to what extent you see it as being broadly representative of interdisciplinary activity generally, or is it really intended to be pretty local, I guess, or constrained? If that makes sense.
Yeah, let me think. So one way one could do that. I've focused, because I'm coming at this primarily through that lens of explanation, and not just the way philosophers of science have thought about explanation, but as they should be a big deal. They're a big achievement. And that's a move against the way that philosophers of science have been discussing explanation. You get a lot of talk about cases that are really not scientifically significant in any way. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm very attached to making them a big deal. And so that means that they're kind of high stakes, there's a lot of values attached to them just by virtue of that. But if you wanted to use this basic approach of thinking about collaborative activity and relax that requirement of it's about whatever the apex achievement is, and think about it more broadly through a wider range of of practices that go into these meetings of specializations, because obviously that's happening in a lot of respects. So on the one hand, I think even though I've got it limited to explanations, because I think of explanations as the sort of open within that special achievement, anything goes really. And so methods, this is where the models as mediators approach is a real inspiration here. It's like, yeah, the resources for building these are very heterogeneous. So in principle, one could probably use this account in a more broad way and ask questions about how methods and other parts of scientific methodologies or other things might connect with one another. I've been zeroing in on what are the things that are really crucial to making an advance in understanding. And so that limits it somewhat, even so. But I think you could relax that and still think about, we want to combine methods in a collaborative act. The social action framework doesn't care about explanation at all. That's a totally different area. And so I've bracketed those together in my own framework. But you could take a social action type account and have a version of these norms. You'd probably want to ground them a little bit differently, because I'm grounding all of this in terms of science's aims. So that's kind of explanation looming pretty large. But I think there are multiple ways. It's already a somewhat open account in the sense of allowing for lots of different things that feed into an explanation to get to be part of it. But you could also just relax those EP assumptions that I made at the start and still apply a social action framework and have it even broader. And if you think about this as a collaborative thing, then that might be all you'd need to generate norms and requirements. I haven't
Right,
done that, but so yeah, so I think there's two ways you could think of it. Is it's pretty open-ended as it is, but you could also make it less about explanation and just make it, how do we characterize what's happening when different fields, different aspects of parts of scientific method connect or don't. And it doesn't have to be all about understanding.
Let me say something that is intended to be a summary of what you just said,
Okay.
as I understand it. And you tell me, please correct me. So you can, it seems to me you could combine both of the social action perspective and the kind of explanatory particularism and the kind of emphasis on models. Which is what I take you to be saying. So something like the social action framework emphasizes a collaboration, emphasizes the kind of integration that occurs when you're walking together as opposed to just walking near somebody, right?
Yeah, the general theory is for activities like social action in general.
Right. So it provides a framework that should be broadly applicable across interdisciplinary activities, right? To the extent that those are social activities.
Yeah.
And then on the IDE side of this, right? It seems like, well, the details of that matter. So the explanations understood as models, and the models, the near term, far term, and middle term coherence, and the various kind of constraints that you specified for the construction of an IDE, and the norms that regulate the practice, right? All of that's, as it was presented, pretty focused on explanation and the understanding that explanation generates. But it seems to me you could abstract over that a little bit and say, instead of models understood in this kind of technical way, think of maybe representations of different aspects of your practice, ways of representing different aspects of practice. A model, so using model very loosely.
Even more, right? Even more. Actually, that is kind of how I'm using the notion of model. And then I'm interested in explanatory ones, and so everything else I say is about that. but models in general, that sounds about right.
Right, and so then the idea of building, kind of finding connections and building bridges that are near term and far term coherent, and or was it near term?
I don't know if those requirements, because those requirements are sort of, there's an achievement, like you could point to it or write it down or sort of talk about its features, and that's the part of a model. The process is part of it, but if you were talking about a method like an activity and how do you combine activities, that might, the whole bridging, you might need to adjust that more. It might look just a lot more like social action theory. The bridging stuff is sort of a model is some kind of achievement, whatever it looks like. So it wouldn't be just like activities are crucial to it, and that's the framework I'm using to think about it. But you also have this like scientific accomplishment that you can maybe abstract from the actions that go into building it. And so what we're talking about might actually be more fodder for social action theory straight up, more than, and because they're not doing, as far as I know, they don't do this diversion with the models that I do.
Okay, fair enough. I guess I was thinking that explanations an action, a kind of action, a collaborative action that we're engaging, right, as you understand it. And so too are all of these other, many of these other interdisciplinary activities are actions that are performed collectively in many cases.
No, that's true.
It's the bridging business that you're emphasizing seems to me essential to inducing interdisciplinarity in those contexts, like data collection or communication or whatever, right? And so I guess what I'm thinking is there's a sort of an abstract structure that kind of emerges from what you've developed.
Would you think that abstract structure though is the collective? That's collective intention. Would that be that?
It could be, but I think
because the pull bridging is almost an analogous version of collective intention, just put on the models.
But one thing that you've emphasized, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, one thing you've emphasized, and by the way, I love talking to Melinda about this stuff. And so talking with Melinda about this stuff for 20 more minutes is not a problem for me. But I would very much love to shut up and let somebody else ask questions. So please do not hesitate to raise your hand. And I will stop. But Johnny, awesome. Okay, let me finish my sentence. So I guess my thinking is that what you're emphasizing are differences, right? Differences between the models, and that's why you need to.
Yeah,
and that's
it is a different. You're right. That is
missing from the collective, the social action framework, right?
You're right. It almost comes back around, and it's like maybe that's something you could apply to thinking about those activities as well. I hadn't thought of it that way at all, but that seems pretty plausible. Johnny.
You're upside down. I don't know how you do that. Okay.
That's so weird. I don't know why.
Oh, you didn't do that on purpose.
That
really is something. I haven't seen that before. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, don't worry about it.
Right. So I don't know much about this stuff. As a lowly, like, brand new grad student. But I think, so we, at MSU Philosophy at least, started the year with, in our colloquium series with Evelyn Brister's talk very recently on, it was like Neurot, the unity of science, like hyper-specialization.
So that's awesome, because Neurot's actually vision of unity of science is really the only close forerunner to any of these ideas, as far as I'm aware. And and it sounds like I haven't looked at a really recent work by Evelyn Brister, but that's really exciting that she's focusing on that same constellation of concepts.
And I'm curious because this was just sort of in passing, and I was thinking about this talk kind of in relation to that.
Well, that makes sense, yeah.
She seems to want to argue that hyper specialization tends to lead to more and more interdisciplinarity, because we're always carving out new fields, I think, is what I gathered from September, but I don't have those notes in front of me or remember the talk very well. I'm just curious because it sounded like you wanted to maybe dismiss that view to suggest that there's a more obvious hyper specialization might just be like really bad. I'm curious if you can expand on that.
Let's see. I guess I would say hyperspecialization is sort of the way I think of where we're at. And there are things about it that are bad. Not so much that it is bad. It's just that's what our science looks like. But there are things that come with it that are undesirable, and we can counterbalance those. In the sense of the fact, I almost think of it more like a fact of, there's a lot of different scientific fields, more all the time. And specialization involves, I haven't talked about this, but it is part of how you become an expert in a field, is learning that style of explanation. Actually, Andrea Woody is the one who pioneered thinking of explanation in this way, as primarily working to build a scientific community and teach people what it means to explain, like a chemist. So her example is the periodic table. And so as you learn how to explain in this field, as you train up, that's what's going on. You're learning what a good explanation looks like, and then how to do your work going forward. And a lot of philosophers and a lot of people in general assume that there is one sort of path that scientists follow to do that. And in fact, that's not what we see, certainly not past a certain level. And there are downsides. I guess that's how I would say it, is that we do have this incredibly specialized, elaborate structure, social epistemic structure of the sciences. And one problem that arises with that is it's unlikely that complicated real world problems are going to be soluble from the standpoint of one specialization. So you need multiple ones. And that's not a new observation at all, but it fits with hyperspecialization. I think there are other philosophers diagnose problems with hyperspecialization that I don't see as problems. So Lige Milgrom, I think that's one of the terms he uses in his Great Endarkment. He's my colleague at Utah, actually, and I just talked with him about this a few days ago. We fight about this a little bit because he does think of hyperspecialization as really blocking certain forms of communication and collaboration. And I don't think so. I think you can work around it, and that's what I'm doing. But I also emphasized, and this was very hand-wavy, but it's stuff I'm thinking about right now, is that a good way to think about scientific goals and progress and what science is for is in relation to these collaborative values and not in relation to here's an explanation that then gets hierarchically imposed on this wild diversity of observations. And that's the sort of traditional picture in philosophy of science of what an explanation looks like. What unifies is usually a single formula that lets you dispense with all the diversity. And it can be kind of localized to one field. That would be theoretical physics or math or logic. And the view of science that I'm trying to articulate and motivate is one where epistemic authority is really widely dispersed, and actually dispersing it more widely is the way to make progress. And so I'm highlighting the benefits of overcoming hyperspecialization because I think the values that are associated with that are ones that have been underrated in philosophy of science. It's not the case that no one has noticed them, but they tend not to be part of specifically the discussions of explanation. That's why I've focused on that issue specifically. But there are probably other ways. I mean, there are other ways in which those concerns about hyperspecialization appear. And so I want to kind of redefine what unity of science is in a way that keeps all that diversity and then lowers the boundaries between different fields. But I don't thereby think that I'm then making of the sciences a complete panmixis, where everything is connected, everything else. I actually often think separation and keeping things separate is fine. And so I guess it's a little, I wouldn't put it as I think hyperspecialization is bad, but I do think it's worth making more of a relational picture of the sciences, that the values that go with that are ones we should make more central scientific values and talk about more as centerpieces of scientific methodology than has been done in philosophy of science traditionally. Does that help? I'm really interested now to see what Brister is saying about unity of science, actually.
Oh my God, it does help so much. Thank you so much. Can I ask a follow-up if no one's waiting?
Please.
Just curious then. So do you think maybe John Dupre gives like a fairly adequate account, but still like not emphasizing the unity of science, in fact, like doing the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because John Dupre's concerns, at least initially in his disunity of science, it's coming from a metaphysics standpoint, and those are the questions. And he still frames his thinking about living things in those terms. And so there's a little bit of a remove between our approaches, but in practice, the pluralism and disunity side, I'm generally in agreement with the way that Dupre passes things out. And so chances are, even though I think our sort of basic philosophical concerns are somewhat different, broadly speaking, yes, I am in agreement with Dupre's kind of approach to most philosophical things and systems of classification, categorization, et cetera. So that I do stress the connections between them, but part of the reason I want to emphasize these connections is that these connections do not get away from the diversity. The diversity is actually a strength of a lot of this. So yeah, I don't see Dupre and I as sort of directly engaged in exactly the same discussion, but certainly thematically and in terms of the way that he makes the ways that he emphasizes facets of the living world fit really well with the concepts that I'm using.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for your question, Johnny. Does anybody else have a question? Either raise your hand or I think that's Bethany.
Michael,
go ahead.
Could I? Yeah. Great. Thank you, Michael, for making it possible for me to tune in on my commute home. I really enjoyed the talk, Dr. Fagan, and look forward to more conversations in the future.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you were able to dial in. That's great.
Yeah. I was intrigued by some of the practical guidelines you mentioned at the end for how to facilitate bridging between two different communities or members of two different communities. And you mentioned, try these things, and then eventually, if no one's coming up with any connections, you can just quit. Yeah. Which I certainly am sympathetic to. And you had also mentioned, I didn't catch the author's names, but some folks who have like lists of different relations that you might throw out as kind of like a menu of options.
Yes.
Did I catch that right?
Yes, absolutely right.
So the list you said is very long. And I've always thought about that too. And then I thought, well, but is the list infinite? Probably not. Yeah. But I wonder if, what do you think about something being a metaphor or a simile as a potential bridge building relation? Is that making a connection in the way you're thinking about it?
Thank you. This is a great question. Thanks so much. I think yes. I think that's likely. The cases I've thought about the most are kind of easy cases because they're in the life science sphere. Where I think metaphors might turn out to be really crucial would be, for example, computer science and some of the bench developmental biology. It's fields that are really disparate. It might be a lot harder to pick out where's the clearest point of contact at all. And a metaphor would be likely, like maybe there's some kind of, I thought noise is something that actually in some kind of formal accounts and lab accounts, you see that. And then the only way to really unpack what does that mean is in a kind of, at least you start with a kind of metaphorical, a metaphor that is at least shared. But then if you drill down into what's going on with it on either side, it's going to be really different. And so I think yes, although I haven't thought through any cases like that, I think that could be really fruitful. And it would be an advantage to having it, rather than having it be some kind of our idea of truth or our idea of laws and explanation. Like some of those topics are really hard to broach and get any kind of consensus on. But one idea, and if you can articulate where the point of contact is. So where I'm thinking there with a metaphor, you might have a sophisticated notion of how it works out on each side, the near side, and then this very fuzzy notion that sort of free floats on the far side. And you want to be able to articulate how you could cross. That might be harder if it's really a kind of something that's very distant, very metaphorical might be tough. But something that's an images and metaphors, I think might actually be really, really valuable, especially when the fields are more disparate, where they're not going to have a clearly overlapping concept. And the cases, the sources I listed are Darden and Mall in 1977, Interfield Theories, which I think is a really underrated piece of philosophy of science. And they have, their language is really different. Philosophy of science looked really different. Models work wasn't a focus. But there's that's where one of the sources of a lot of different kinds of connections came from. And William Bechtel in 1986 has a kind of compendium of ways of connecting, again, with the life sciences. So it's very life science inflected, but relations between different elements of different explanatory models that are exactly along those lines. But you're going to have, for fields that are more disparate, and Darden and Mall are also thinking primarily the life sciences, you'll have to get even more creative. And I've only thought about this from a few perspectives in my own work, but there's a lot more opportunities. And computer science is an area where replicability and reproducibility, those are, again, completely different notions and ideas about evidence. So a lot of the big picture methodology aspects are different, but finding metaphors that will build really substantive connections, that could be really important. Yeah, I think that's a really fruitful way to go, but I don't have a kind of handy case that uses it, although I suspect there will be a lot of them.
Yeah, I mean, it raises questions then of like how strong of a connection is a metaphor. It probably varies. You know, sometimes they're quite loose, as in using boundary objects.
Yeah, thank you. That was one point I wanted to make sure I mentioned, that the idea of a boundary object is really closely related to this.
Yeah, and then other times the metaphors can go quite deep and expensive to almost some kind of, you know, synthesis or identity between the two, and it makes you kind of wonder what's going on inside that metaphor. There's probably a bundle of relations that are happening in there that are weaving multiple relations back and forth together. And so I'd be curious to look at that list in Bechtel and in other places. And I'm just curious, have you thought about different kinds of relations, and do some of them represent something a little stronger than bridging, or
not so much? But actually the way I would take that. Oh, and thank you, Michael. I see that someone asked for those sources and I mentioned them, and thank you. That'd be great. So right. I gestured, but Bethany, to exact this point, but I didn't do any more than gesture, which is once the bridging connections are established, I'm focusing on like, what's the easiest thing to do? But often you would want to build stronger ties after that. And I think the point you just made, where you start with a metaphor that might be thin, but maybe it's much richer and deeper, and you can explore this ramifying structure of analogies that will then build a firmer tie. That would be great. I think with disparate fields, it might not be likely, but it would actually give you a stronger tie, which again is, I think, more likely to yield innovative conceptual innovations. IDE, as I framed it, aren't going to do a ton of that. I think it's still doing things that are valuable. And so I focus primarily on that. But there are opportunities for stronger ties. And especially, I think that would be something that would emerge if there's a lot of cases to look at with this project. And then you could get more general type patterns of, a metaphor that's really rich in these ways would be a really good way to build a stronger tie. I don't feel like I'm at a point where I could say that definitively. Like, what would you look for that kind of fruitful tie, fruitful metaphor to pursue? But I could see getting to that point using this kind of approach. And that's really neat. That would be a neat result. I'll accentuate the negative a little bit too, because I do think that it can be really valuable to know not to put any effort into, this is coming from my own experience, but to know when it's bad to put any more effort into it. And what I mean is not to give up on everything interdisciplinary, but just to reframe it so you don't need to have the IDE. You don't need to have an understanding achievement there. You could still combine other things, but just don't try to build a conjoined explanation. It's not going to work. And I think sort of cutting your losses on that and then finding what else can you do? It doesn't mean that all interdisciplinarity is off the table. It just means that kind is off the table. But I think knowing when to not force it is actually really important as well. And maybe you just need different people in there. And some of that flow chart could be viewed as who do you want on this team to do this? And that would be one way that I could see it working. Plenty of people aren't interested in making these connections, and that's totally fine. And this gets back to the point that Johnny made earlier, and I'm really glad he raised as well, that in fact, it's not problematic as such to just have all these different fields. It's fine mostly, but sometimes you want to make connections, and when you do, how to do it more efficiently.
Thank you, Dr. Fagan.
Sometimes interdisciplinary explanation requires interdisciplinary explainers, and you don't always have those people in your collaboration. I think that's a really important point. We have reached the end of our allotted time, and I want to make sure that we respect your time, everyone, and thanks again for coming. And thanks, Dr. Fagan, very much for your talk and for your great answers to the questions. We really
thank you so much.
Really grateful for your participation in the series and your willingness to be a visiting faculty member with, visiting, I guess, faculty member with C4I. But wonderful. Thanks everybody for being here, and I hope that everyone has a great weekend.
All right, thanks again, folks. This was so helpful for me, and thanks to everyone for their questions and kind remarks.